Okay, so let's get right into it. You ready to dig into this mine waste situation in India?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, we've got this clarification from the Indian Ministry of Mines that's specifically directed at the Government of Chhattisgarh, dated November 28th, 2024. And it's got me thinking this is about a lot more than just what to do with leftover rocks.
You hit the nail on the head. It really boils down to a question that any country with a major mining industry has to wrestle with. What do you do with all the stuff you don't want when you're pulling out all the stuff you do?
Yeah, makes sense. So is India basically just saying get more land to deal with all that waste?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. The clarification focuses on this idea of non-mineralized areas. But to really grasp what that means, we need to rewind a bit.
Okay, let's go back in time then.
Back in 2014, the Supreme Court of India made a pretty landmark ruling in the Goa Foundation versus Union of India case. They basically said dumping mine waste outside of the designated lease areas is a big no-no.
I can see why. You do want mining companies just scattering waste wherever they please.
Right.
Got to go somewhere, but it's got to be controlled.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of non-mineralized areas comes into play. Imagine it like a puzzle. You've got the main picture that's your mine lease area, but then you have these extra pieces that don't quite fit in the main picture. Those are like the non-mineralized areas. They might be close by or maybe further away, but they're not suitable for mining themselves.
Okay, so they're adding pieces to the puzzle, but
Yep.
those pieces are only for waste, not for more digging.
Yeah.
Got it. But how does that actually play out in practice? I mean, can states just hand over more land to mining companies whenever they ask for it?
Not exactly. There are some pretty strict conditions involved. The state government actually has to demonstrate to the Indian Bureau of Mines, the IBM, that the existing lease area just isn't enough to handle all the waste.
So the IBM's kind of like the referee here,
Yeah.
making sure things are done by the book.
That's a great way to put it. They're the ones with the expertise to really assess the situation, make sure the land is truly non-mineralized, and determine how much extra land is really necessary.
Gotcha. And what happens if a company tries to get sneaky and starts digging for minerals in this extra land that's supposed to be just for waste?
The Ministry of Mines is crystal clear on that. It's a hard no. That land is strictly for managing the waste, not for expanding the mining operation itself.
So it sounds like this whole clarification is about creating a system where mining companies have a legal and regulated way to deal with all their waste.
Exactly. It's about trying to strike a balance, trying to meet the economic demands of the mining industry while making sure the environment is protected and waste is managed responsibly. And that's where things get really interesting. This whole system kind of hinges on this concept of what makes an area non-mineralized.
Yeah, that term's come up a bunch. But I gotta admit, I'm a little fuzzy on how they actually decide that.
You might think it's simple, like no minerals means no mining, but it's not quite that straightforward. It actually comes down to economics.
Okay, now you've got me curious. How does economics factor into all of this?
Think of it this way. Let's say you find a tiny speck of gold in your backyard. Technically, there's gold there, right? But it's nowhere near enough to justify bringing in all the heavy equipment and starting a whole mining operation. The cost of getting that gold out would be way more than the gold itself is worth.
So it's not just about whether the minerals are there, it's about whether it makes financial sense to actually extract them.
Exactly. And that's where the Indian Bureau of Mines comes back into the picture. They've got geologists and all sorts of experts who do these really detailed surveys and analyses to figure out if mining in a specific area would be profitable. You know, they look at the concentration of minerals, how easy it would be to extract them, the market value, and a whole bunch of other things.
So like a super thorough cost-benefit analysis, but for rocks.
Pretty much. And based on all that, the IBM can say, all right, this area might have a little bit of this mineral or that, but it just doesn't make economic sense to mine it. So we're calling it non-mineralized.
Makes sense to me. But how does this all tie back to this whole mine waste disposal thing?
Remember that Supreme Court ruling from back in 2014? The ones that said no dumping waste outside of those leased areas? Well, this clarification from the Ministry of Mines is basically a way to work within the boundaries of that ruling while still giving them a practical way to handle all that waste.
So by adding these non-mineralized areas into a mining lease, even if they're not right next to the actual mine, they're creating a legally sound way to deal with the waste.
Exactly. It's a pretty smart legal move that addresses the environmental concerns from the Supreme Court and also the real-world needs of the mining industry.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. Because on one hand, this could be a huge step forward in how India manages mine waste.
Yeah.
You know, maybe they can move from this reactive, clean up the mess later approach to a more proactive system where they plan for the waste from the beginning.
And on the other hand,
Well, yeah. Couldn't this create a loophole for companies to just gobble up more land?
that's a valid concern. And that's why transparency and accountability are absolutely essential. The process for deciding which land is non-mineralized has to be super rigorous and open to public scrutiny. Plus, there needs to be really strong oversight to make sure companies are using this land for waste disposal only and not for anything else.
So it's not just about the rules themselves. It's about making sure those rules are actually followed and enforced.
Exactly. And that's where groups like civil society organizations, journalists, local communities, they all have a huge role to play. They need to be the ones holding both the mining companies and the government accountable, making sure this whole system is used responsibly, and that the people who are most impacted by mining have their voices heard.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on this whole non-mineralized area thing for mine waste in India. And I'm not going to lie, it's a lot to wrap my head around.
It is definitely complex, but I think now that we've got the basics down, we can tackle the big question: what does all this mean for the future of mining in India? Is this a positive change, or are there some potential problems lurking around the corner?
Exactly. We've talked about the legal side of things, the IBM's role, the importance of transparency and accountability. But what about the real-world impact?
Well, let's start with the good stuff. This clarification could really change the game when it comes to protecting the environment around mines. Think about it. If companies have specific designated areas for their waste, it could really cut down on illegal dumping.
Which we know can be a disaster for the environment.
Mhm.
Water sources communities that depend on that water.
Absolutely. And having this regulated system could lead to better waste management overall. The Ministry of Mines specifically says that the state government needs to work with the IBM to figure out the right size and location for these extra areas. That suggests they're moving towards a more planned out, scientifically based approach to waste disposal.
So instead of just dumping the waste wherever is convenient, they're at least trying to minimize the environmental damage.
Right. And there's another potential upside that's worth mentioning. This new system could actually encourage mining companies to look into more sustainable ways to deal with their waste. If they know they've got a limited space for disposal, they might be more likely to invest in things like reprocessing or recycling, turning what was once considered waste into something they can use.
Okay, so that's the optimistic take.
Okay.
But I know you like to look at all sides of the issue. What are some of the potential downsides or risks that we should be aware of?
You're right. We got to be careful. One concern is that this system could unintentionally create a kind of backwards incentive. If companies know they've got access to more land for waste, they might actually be less motivated to reduce the amount of waste they're producing in the first place.
Kind of like when you get a bigger house, suddenly you find more stuff to fill it up with.
Exactly. And that could really work against efforts to promote waste reduction and more sustainable mining. Another worry is that the process of deciding which land is non-mineralized might not always be as transparent or accountable as it should be.
You mean there's a chance for corruption or shady deals?
It's a possibility we can't ignore. And that's why it's so important to have strong safeguards in place. There needs to be serious oversight, independent monitoring, and chances for the public to get involved in the decision-making process. We can't just take the government's or the mining company's word for it.
So the success of this whole thing really depends on how well it's actually implemented and enforced.
Absolutely. And this is where civil society organizations, journalists, local communities, they all become super important. They need to be the watchdogs, making sure both the mining companies and the government are doing what they're supposed to, and making sure the voices of the people who are most affected by mining are actually heard.
This whole deep dive has really opened my eyes. It's not just about some technical legal document. It's about these bigger questions. How do we balance economic development with protecting the environment? How do we make sure mining benefits everyone, not just a small group? How do we make sure the voices of the people most affected by mining are actually listened to and respected?
Couldn't have said it better myself. This isn't just about one document in India. It's about a much bigger conversation about the kind of future we want to build.
A huge thank you to Mining 360 Services for all their amazing insights on this topic. Their expertise was really key in helping us understand all this.
Their commitment to responsible mining is truly inspiring.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to dig deeper into this issue. We've put links to the original documents and some further reading in the show notes.
Because at the end of the day, staying informed and engaged is the best way to create a more sustainable and equitable future for all of us.
This has been quite a journey. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and never stop being curious.